your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and I might just mention we're going to, a little bit later this hour, and especially next hour, get into some other issues in the news. There's quite a bit to cover, so again, you can stay tuned for some of those conversations, and we have posted quite a number of articles, and we'll post more tomorrow because there's just a lot happening in what oftentimes tends to be a fairly quiet July, but not this case. So we'll get to that in just a few minutes, but I thought it would be helpful for your Christian life to hear a little bit from this book, which came out earlier this year by Karl Clauson. You may remember him as an individual who is best known for the work he does with Moody Radio, Carl and Crew Mornings, and as an individual that has been so much involved in educating us through the radio, a committed follower of Christ for more than a third of a century. And for our listeners up there in Alaska, and I'm going to be with you later this month again, he was one of those individuals that completed the Iditarod Trail Sled Dog Race at the young age of 18, which you need to remember in just a minute because it comes very handy and a very important part of the conversation we're going to have with him about this new book, Killing Sin, Conquer the One Thing That Is Defeating You. It is published by our good friends at Moody. You should be able to find it at your local bookstore, but if not, we've got information about that on our website. But first of all, Karl, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, it's great to be back with you, my friend.
It's always good to chat with somebody who is certainly the voice that so many of us hear around the country, and appreciate the good work that you do. And I might just mention that as I first saw the book, I was thinking about the fact that we at Probe Ministries had produced a week of radio programs which had the title How to Kill Sin, John Owen's The Mortification of Sin. Yeah. And so I'm not even into the first chapter where you mentioned that. So again, in some respects, these ideas that we're going to be sharing go back centuries, don't they?
Oh, they do. They go all the way back to the Apostle Paul. If you live according to the flesh, you're going to die. But if by the power of the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. And Jesus himself said, if your eye and hand cause you to sin, gouge it out and cut it off. Hyperbole for sure, but very real.
I might just mention, too, the book is endorsed by all sorts of people we have on the program: Erwin Lutzer, Janet Parshall, Michael Radelnick, as well as Sam Storms, Chris Fabry, Arlene Pelican, Gary Rosberg, Robert Lewis, who you quote quite a bit, Kathy Cook, and others. And so, again, I think people are going to find this book very helpful. But even as we get into the first chapter, before that, you kind of tell your story. And anybody that is familiar with you know that you grew up in Alaska, became a Christian in Alaska, in part because after finishing the dog sled race, there was still an emptiness, and of course there was an addiction, and in some respects, that's one of the many reasons why you decided to write this book, isn't it?
No question, Kerby. I was a very lost young man, especially after the Iditarod was over. 21 days, 8 hours, 12 minutes, and 32 seconds to get from Anchorage, Alaska to Nome, Alaska. And I would have thought, I thought in my young mind, if I complete this race, I didn't know about Pascal's God-shaped void, but the cry of my soul is that something would fill it up. And although I was raised in church, baptized as a young boy, knew a lot of memory verses, I was not a follower of Christ, Kerby. So on February 11th of one cold winter day in Anchorage, Alaska, God just said to me, "Are you done yet?" And on that day, he called me out of darkness and into the light. But yeah, I was set free from a raging cocaine addiction, and I'm not afraid to share that because everybody without Jesus is putting something into that God-shaped void, Kerby, as you well know.
Well, again, for those of you that like to actually take some notes. A lot of this breaks into threes. We're going to talk about movement 1, getting honest, movement 2, becoming powerful, movement 3, killing sin, and then within those there are 3 sections as well, 11 chapters and all of that. But let's get into that first one, getting honest. I do appreciate, as I read through your book, the vulnerability and the transparency, but it isn't just for you, it's for anyone listening right now who wants to actually do what the title of the book is, Kill Sin. You have to start with honesty, don't you?
Yeah, you got to get honest with yourself and with God. I think I love recovery ministries, but one of the downsides with recovery ministry, Kerby, is that we have an us and them mentality. And it's almost like a bless your heart. You've got pornography, you've got some kind of eating addiction, you've got pornography, and the list goes on. But it creates this us and them mentality that they're in recovery, almost a ... thank God I'm not over there. We're all in recovery, Kerby.
That's right.
Every one of us, we're all in recovery. No one avoids it. In fact, those to be pitied are those that think that they've somehow arrived or aren't in the big sins, but we're all in recovery, whether it's redeeming time well or wasting it foolishly, eating too much, drinking, started off sipping wine, now it's sipping us. I don't care what it is, even gossip in the lobby or uncontrolled anger. We all have sin in our life that, if we're not careful, can become a death loop, and we need to put it to death.
One of the things I appreciate, Karl, also is that at the end of each one of your chapters, you have a section on reflection and application. I just mentioned that you're the pastor of vision and leadership at the 180 Chicago Church, and in some respects, this would be something that you could use as a small group. I would think most people will grab this and want to read through it individually, but it certainly could be something you could do in a small group setting. And then you have a QR code so that you can get some of the devotional series on the 3 strategies. So really, in some respects, you've created this so that someone can pick it up, begin to use it immediately. It's sort of what I call plug and play, isn't it?
Yeah, Killing Sin is not a book to read. It's a life to live, Kerby.
Yes.
And so we've tried to do everything we can to resource people. And that's why the book is 138 pages, but the resources go well beyond that.
I might just mention, too, that we have been talking about this idea of getting honest, and at the end of each one of those, you, of course, have some sections. For example, one on Romans 12:9. What would it look like if you truly hated the one thing that is defeating you? How can you apply Romans 12:9? And you might say, well, okay, I've got to look up that verse. Well, then you even have a devotional series on that as well. So, Karl, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to spend just a few more minutes kind of giving people an introduction, because after maybe some people have read this over the next couple of months, we can have you back and talk about some of the success stories. But if you're one of those individuals that want to know where we're going, first movement is known as getting honest. Find it, own it, and hate it. Then the second movement, if you're taking some notes, becoming powerful, humility, proximity, and liberty. And then finally, the third movement, which we'll get to certainly before the bottom of the hour, killing sin, confess it, attack it, and block it. So practical, great material, lots of good illustrations, of course, from an individual that is very gifted on radio. And if you aren't already listening to Moody Radio, there's certainly ways in which you can do so, even if you do not have that radio program in your own community. You can simply go online and find that as well. By the way, you can go on the line right now and find out more about Karl Clauson, as well as about his book. So let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Heather McDonald asked an interesting question. Is rioting acceptable? She follows it up with a question, if so, how much? She focused her attention on 2 different pictures of what happened in Los Angeles. The first is the official one from California's elected leaders in the media. The second is what she calls the ground-level view from law enforcement. The incident she discussed is what happened when a crowd broke into the ICE detention center downtown to liberate the detainees. The vandals overpowered the skeleton crew of National Guard soldiers using improvised bombs made from M80 firecrackers, nails, and broken glass. Politicians said local law enforcement had everything under control. She even reminds us that the day before a mob surrounded the two ICE agents, a dozen men jumped out of a truck, grabbed the handcuffed suspect from the back of the ICE van, threw the suspect into the truck, and fled. The ICE agents gave chase, but without sirens or lights, the pursuit was futile. Neither of these two incidents were reported by the media. Instead, the official narrative and the message from the legacy media was that these protests were largely peaceful. They were also labeled by a federal judge as some stray violent incidents. In her commentary, she reminds us of a phrase used by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, defining deviancy down. Our society tends to minimize bad behavior and even criminal behavior. If you've ever read the book of Isaiah, you will recognize this tendency. In Isaiah 5:20, we read, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness." Unfortunately, we seem to be normalizing riots and criminal behavior. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we are talking about this book, Killing Sin, Conquer the One Thing That Is Defeating You, published by Moody, written by Karl Clauson. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but of course we have information about him as well as this book and other resources at our website, pointofview.net. And of course, Karl, one of the things you talk about is really this idea of getting this deep into your heart, because it does seem to me that sometimes, as you point out, you really need to own it, and you go into some detail about that, and then to hate it, and that's all part of getting honest. But certainly there are some other things we could say there, and perhaps you have some, but before too long I want to get on to becoming powerful and killing sin. But since you do spend a fairly significant amount of the first part of your book talking about getting honest, are there some other things that we need to focus on? Because it does seem to me that you see that as a really significant first step, because half of the book is devoted to that.
Yeah, getting honest is vital. This is a big miss, and I don't know where we missed it. We often don't see hate as a virtue.
Yes.
You might say, what in the world?
That.
But if we look at Romans 12:9, we find Paul saying, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. My biblical contention, and by the way, some people might think, well, how in the world can God's love and hate coexist? I think love is enhanced by what he stands against. But it's not just what we're called to stand against in others. If we're going to hold fast to what is good in us, we need to get a boiling hatred for what is evil. That's not us, but the sin that indwells us. And I don't think we put sin to death oftentimes, Kerby, because we don't have a proper emotion around the sin in our own lives.
Well said.
It's easy to look at others and get hatred. It's easy to look at others' actions and be quite disturbed. But we need to move beyond disturbance to outright hatred for sin that is derailing our life and keeping us from bearing fruit. So that's all I want to add about that. That's vitally important, Kerby.
I think the pivot verse there is one I just mentioned earlier, and you do mention again Romans 12:9. Let love be genuine. That's the first part. But the part we're focusing on, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. And so, as you say, it's not just like frowning at this or trying to sidestep it or saying, well, I'll just set it on the shelf for now. It's to hate it in the sense that you have to have a hatred of sin, which then frees you up, as you talk about, to grab something that is better rather than to kind of keep it off on the side and come back to it every once in a while just because, well, I'm a fallen person, we're all broken, and all those kinds of things. If you start with this idea of killing sin or the mortification of the flesh, if you want to use a phrase from the Puritans, that's, I think, what gets you to the next step, isn't it?
It really is. And, you know, I counsel and have worked with, as a pastor, thousands of people. And the ones who get victory over sin, and I'm not talking about becoming sinlessly perfect. What I'm talking about is this incredible madness cycle that anyone who's a genuine follower of Jesus has encountered or is living in right now. And that is, why can I not get victory over this thing? It's sin and it's shame and repent and repeat. That's the madness cycle. And we play a little bit of spiritual patty cake with these things that God says, no, you got to get the right emotion around this thing. You got to see what it's doing to steal joy from your life and get some hatred around it.
Your middle section, of course, is becoming powerful. And again, you talk about this issue of humility. By the way, I love all the icons that go with this, you know, man sitting down and praying, proximity, and then, of course, the idea of breaking chains and the rest, which gives you liberty. So again, that's the part where once you have hated, then you can begin to see where the power begins, how the power flows, and when the power moves, right?
Yeah, here's the thing, Kerby. We have thought in the Christian life, too many, and this is not just around North America, this is around the globe. This is one of the baits of Satan. Most people know it's God's power that saves us because we're at the end of ourselves. Blessed are the poor in spirit. But we actually think I need to change my life. That is a lie out of the pit of hell. When you get boiling hatred for your sin, do not set off to attempt to eradicate it. You'll be playing spiritual whack-a-mole. You'll gut it out for a week or two, really just a few days, truth be told, and then it'll be back again. You can iron fist this, you can bootstrap it for a few days, but it'll come back again. The beauty of the gospel is that Christ in me is the hope of glory. Of Titus 2:11 and 12 says, grace saves us and grace trains us to renounce ungodliness, worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, godly lives in this present age. Here's the problem. We're tapping grace for salvation because there's no other way. And then we tap our own strength for sanctification. Kerby, it's crazy. But I think what we've done is we've tried to layer together the American dream and God's vision for ourselves. I'm not against the American dream. It's great. But part and parcel of the American dream is all about bootstrapping it.
Yeah.
The life in the kingdom of God has nothing to do with our effort. It has to do with the finished work of Christ. That's the difference. So when we're talking becoming powerful, yeah, you got to humble yourself under God's mighty hand. He will lift you up, 1 Peter 5:6. You've got to live in proximity to Jesus, John 15. Jesus said it. You abide in the vine, you are going to bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do, Kerby, we know it, nothing, my man.
Yeah.
And what we've thought is that apart from him, oh, maybe I can muster something here. No addictions, no kind of behaviors that really are stealing your joy and the joy of producing fruit in your life. None of those can be dealt with without proximity to God. That is paramount. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the liberty is the power of the Spirit of God that speaks to us throughout the day from God's Word. And Kerby, I get so excited talking with you here, I can almost come uncorked. But I really believe this stuff, Kerby. And the key is, once you've identified that sin, do not think you've got to go get it dealt with because you can't change your life. God can.
That's right. And again, your title of your book, Karl, is Killing Sin, and the last section is Killing Sin: to confess it, to attack it, and to block it, to break the stronghold, but also, just as you finish off that section, to place boundaries to prevent sin. And all of it gets back to Romans 8, that if you live according to the flesh, you'll die, but if you live according to the Spirit, you will live. And it seems to me that we are really talking about a choice that we need to make. And so just before we run out of time, Karl, tell us how to use this book. It seems to me that this is something that individuals could go through and certainly study this, but I think you need an accountability partner to help you with this.
Yeah.
But more importantly, it does seem to me the way you've written this as a pastor and a teacher, this could be something a small group or Bible fellowship could use as well.
Yeah, our first QR code in the book has a leader guide that none of these QR codes are attached to anything but a free resource. But the leader guide actually helps you facilitate how to walk through it with others. But here's Kerby. Here's what I want people to know. When you go to killing sin, and by the way, the Word of God is central to this. The Word of God is the Rhema word 70 times in the New Testament. It's used, and the most powerful imagery is the temptation of Jesus. He says, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word," Rhema word, spoken word of God that proceeds from the mouth of God. He used Deuteronomy. He had the word. He was armed. Jesus, the God-man. And then you go to Ephesians 6, and there you find the word again. Take up the sword of the Spirit. The only offensive weapon of war, Kerby, is the Rhema word of God. And I think what I want people to know when they look at the reoccurrent sin patterns in their life, that they try to push into the shadows because they haven't gotten victory. And we all struggle with things. I want you to know God can do more in the 11th hour than you can do in the prior 10. And this is a beautiful thing. Our God loves you. He's not condemning you. That's the voice of Satan. Our God wants you, longs for you to get a victory so that you can get back about bearing fruit in all aspects of your life again. And that's my heart of empathy here. This is not an angry book. This is a hope-filled book.
Karl, it is always great to chat with you. I would recommend that people follow some of the links that we have, which send you to your Facebook page and Twitter and all the rest. And also, we, of course, even have a link to 7 Resolutions, which is another one of your books we've talked about. So some great resources. Karl, say hi to all our good friends up there at Moody Radio.
I will.
And look forward to the next opportunity.
Kerby, I so appreciate you, and thank you for this time.
Going to take a break. When we come back, a lot more to cover. All that coming up right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, I might just mention, and we have not mailed them out yet, but the August issue of our Outlook, I'll hold up the article that I've written, and it has this title, Trump versus Harvard, and it's a relationship issue that we'll be talking about. It also relates very much to the conversation we're going to have right now, and this comes from, again, some of the connections we have to the organization Young Voices. Matter of fact, yesterday we had our Millennial Roundtable, but I wanted to give you a chance to hear from Gabriela Blanco. She was born and raised in Havana, Cuba. Now, she and her family, of course, experienced all the things of what happens when you live in an authoritarian government like Cuba. At the age of 23, she, on her own, moved to the Cayman Islands. She lived there for 7 years, but eventually was able to come to the United States and join her family, her father and siblings. And for quite some time were actually speakers. They were giving their testimony for Gideon's International. She holds a master's degree from University of the UK. I might just mention she's also a speaker for the Dissident Project. We have a link to that as well. But most importantly, I have this article that she has written. I just called it From Cuba to Harvard, but the actual title is I Grew Up in Cuba, America's Campus Censorship Rings Alarm Bells. And so, Gabriela, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Let's, if I can, maybe talk a little bit about that. You grew up under the authoritarian rule of what was in Cuba at the time and still exists to this day. But somehow you see a real similarity in terms of how censorship was used on that island and how it seems to be used today on the university campus. Can you explain?
Yes, that's correct. The increasing censorship that we've been seeing in American academia over the past years is really concerning. And that's the first thing I noticed after moving here. I'm a mom, so I've been really invested in education and possibilities and what that will look like for my children in the future. We've seen hundreds of reports of students and student organizations being penalized and suffering consequences just for speech on college campuses or on their private social media, especially when expressing views, like conservative views or views about biology or biological sex or a lot of uncomfortable topics that are being labeled as hate speech. So definitely that raises a lot of concerns for me because in Cuba, it was pretty much the same way. The amount of censorship and indoctrination that we had to grow up with and in our years in school, they were all labeled the same. You were supposed to behave a certain way, speak a certain way, and it was all in the name of social well-being and in the name of protecting students from hate speech and in the name of protecting your country. So there's a lot of that being seen over here.
Let's talk about the fact that when you were growing up, you were required, I know you probably weren't, but many of your fellow students, teachers were required to monitor any counter-revolutionary speech or hate speech. We now see students that just say that I believe that boys are boys and girls are girls, that boys can't become girls, or that marriage is between one man and one woman. That's all considered hate speech, and it sounds like the kinds of things that you hear in Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua.
Yes, these countries followed the same script, and this is the case we saw recently with the Colombia student that was called in and had an investigation opened simply because he stated in his own personal social media, not even in campus, that sex was biologically determined, and that somehow was investigated for being reported as hateful speech. So these countries you mentioned, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, pretty much the same thing. Professors and students had to watch one another and had to report any kind of behavior that was seen as counter-revolutionary or hateful. Entire faculties were replaced with people that were loyal to the state and loyal to the ideas that they were looking for. And we're seeing a lot of that here too. A lot of professors as well and students suffering the consequences and choosing to keep quiet just because they want to hold on to their jobs and their careers and not suffer the peer pressure that we've been seeing, which is really real.
Well, and that's part of the issue I did want to get into, because there is kind of a mindset that says, well, just keep your head down, even if insane things are being said, even if things that are anti-biblical are being said, or even just things that violate just basic common sense. Don't challenge it. It's not going to do any good. And it's reminiscent of a book that we've recommended before. We've even made it available to many of our donors, which has the title Live Not by Lies, which is kind of a manual for Christian dissidents. And if you're not familiar, Rod Dreher has been an individual that has interviewed people in other places where there have been authoritarian governments, primarily in Eastern Europe. And the argument, live not by lies, really goes back to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in which he said you should live not by lies. But really what's being done first in Cuba and Nicaragua, and of course also in the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc countries, is to get you to believe, if you will, contrary things. And if you even dare to speak up and use biblical morality, even any kind of absolute views of morality, or any kind of common sense, you are punished. And so ultimately, it's almost like, if you will, propaganda, maybe even brainwashing, don't you think?
Absolutely. And fear, as I mentioned in my article, is more effective at silencing people than any law will ever be. It's a real fear. People are afraid of consequences, and people have faced real consequences. Like, their livelihoods have been affected, their careers. But as uncomfortable as that is, there is no other option for individuals to really defend free speech and stand up against whichever institution, whether it's private or government, is trying to manipulate and control speech. And everyone needs to be willing to face the consequences and come together and say no more, because it's the only real way to really hold on to those civil rights and those liberties that are slowly being taken away.
Let's, if we can, talk about action items, because we're all about that. As a matter of fact, we even have a take action section on our website. And you suggest that we should not just rely on an institution to preserve our civil rights. We are fortunate right now that the current administration seems to believe more in free speech than the previous administration, but you still argue that the only way to really address this issue is, as you just illustrated a minute ago, by taking personal responsibility, by pushing back, and by refusing to stay silent in the face of an institution that is actually trying to take away your rights. Can you explain?
Yes, regardless of how reassuring the current administration could be regarding something like speech and protecting students' opinions on campuses, I always caution everyone to be very careful, again, like when it comes to who looks like it's coming to save you. And even though censorship in academia is a huge, real issue, and people are facing consequences, and the reports are there, and there is a huge bias because it's been experienced on both sides of the political spectrum, but it's largely seen on the conservative religious side. So that is all real. However, when the government, the federal government, comes in and starts using public funding as leverage to push that institution's political stance in one direction or another, that causes a different issue altogether, because that means power is just shifted from one institution to the other one. And then now it's the federal government being able to do that themselves. Now, whether Harvard, which is a wealthy, extremely wealthy private organization, should be receiving public funding, even if it's for the purpose of research, that's a different subject altogether. But the point is, the government should not be in a position where they are allowed to push them in a direction or another one. And that's where people, individuals come in. They do need to push back themselves. And those are the action items like we have to have as students and as parents and everyone in general. We have to stand up for what we believe. We have to defend free speech even when we disagree or ideas are uncomfortable. And we have to hold both institutions, but government as well, accountable when we see that type of overreach.
Let's see if we can take a break. When we come back, let me first of all encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. The article I've posted here, I just gave it the title From Cuba to Harvard, but actually the real title is I Grew Up in Cuba, America's Campus Censorship Rings Alarm Bells. Fits very much, almost hand in glove with the one of the articles and many of the other articles that will be in our August issue of Outlook that will not be mailed out for just a little while, but you will be looking for it and see some of the material we're talking about today. When we come back, I also do want to get into a little bit more about what this means, for example, to international students coming here. And again, just some of the similarities we see between things that were said by people in Cuba that we hear being said today, sometimes on college campuses. We'll come back and continue our conversation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing our conversation for a few more minutes with Gabriela Blanco. If you would like to know more about her, we have quite a bit of information on the website, including this article, which I would commend to you. And Gabriela, let's, if we can, talk about something that is of concern, and that is when you were in Cuba, many times you would hear individuals, some of your peers say, I don't want to say fill in the blank out loud. And now you're hearing American students on campus saying, I don't want to say, fill in the blank out loud. It does seem almost completely parallel, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. We're seeing the same attitude from students and professors because it's the natural reaction when you feel threatened. you don't want to lose something, then you tend to want to stay quiet.
And it seems to me that we also have international students who are kind of in the midst of all this because they are coming, maybe thinking that America is the land of freedom, that in some of their countries of origin, there was a suppression of speech. And I think maybe they come here thinking that they're going to be able to express viewpoints that were never allowed. And then they get here and come to find that maybe it's not Cuba, but it isn't exactly the land of the free and the home of the brave, is it?
Right, and I've experienced that myself. I'm hoping that's what's going to motivate most international students to start speaking up. We all expected to indeed be moving to the land of the free, where we can finally express our sentiments and our opinions on all these controversial topics. And it turns out we found more resistance on some of these issues that we found in our own home countries. So it's been shocking.
Just amazing to me. I just thought I'll throw that in as well because it's another issue. Near the end of your article, you talk about the fact that we must reject all forms of authoritarianism, especially those disguised as safety. And I mentioned a book a minute ago. Let me mention a different book this time, The Coddling of the American Mind. It is written by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. We've had Jonathan Haidt on the program in the past, and one of the sections that they talk about there is the rise of what they call safetyism. At first, it's the idea that I want to keep kids safe, and that means I want them to have a helmet on them when they're riding their bicycle. I want them to be able to have safety when they go into the city park and not be approached by individuals that do them harm. And so the emphasis first was on physical safety, but over time, Gabriela, there was this idea of emotional safety that, well, professors have to give trigger words. We need to have safe spaces. And it does seem to me that one of the biggest concerns that you have is that all of this authoritarianism is coming in on, if I could use the metaphor of a Trojan horse, in that we want to keep you safe, so we're going to control speech, we're going to limit what people can say, and we're certainly not going to hurt your feelings by presenting a viewpoint that maybe you have never heard before. And it does seem to me that that's one of those things that we need to take advantage of and begin to evaluate and recognize that you're illustrating as an individual that's come out of authoritarian regimes, how sometimes these are seductively snuck into the curriculum and into our schools and into our society today.
Correct. Censorship and ultimately tyranny is always packaged in this nice way, where they are protecting you, in the name of social justice and equality and public safety, and it all sounds amazing, and we all want those things. That's why critical thinking is so important. We must learn to identify where there is an actual threat of violence involved and where it's just an uncomfortable opinion that I might dislike, but I need to learn to live with it and I need to respect it. So then my own uncomfortable opinion is then respected in return. So we are seeing that same thing over here, and people are unfortunately out of options, right? So definitely always be mindful of who is coming to save you, of who is trying to protect you, because it's not going to be an institution, and again, it's not going to be the government, regardless of how we might sympathize or not with a specific administration. The power to protect people's individual freedom and individual civil rights should be with the people, not with either of those institutions.
Let me just mention that we first heard about you through Young Voices, and I'm just thrilled to introduce you to our audience. But we also have a link to the dissidentproject.org. And if you scroll down, you'll see some different individuals that are speakers, including you. And it does seem to me that this would be a way in which, if people say, I would like to have this as a forum that we could have, maybe this could be something that we could present to to our community, to our church, maybe to our political group. If indeed people would like to know more about what you are writing about, if they would like to know more about the Dissident Project, we have that link. And maybe talk about the opportunity for people to schedule you and have you come speak.
Absolutely. So the Dissident Project is a wonderful initiative. They basically put people like me who fled regimes that are totalitarian and are now here in the United States. They put them in front of student audiences. So we are able to share our life experiences, sort of what happened in our home countries, what brings us here, and answers hopefully some of the questions that the high school students here in America might have. So it's just an incredible way to have people actually face-to-face with someone who has lived through some of these failed policies and some of these ideas that have been tried and have failed. And it's always a wonderful opportunity getting to speak to younger minds over here. Welcome to your school free of charge. Just go on the website, you book a dissident, you can see our bios over there, our backgrounds, and you can choose whoever you'd like to come to your school. Well, would love to do that.
Let me just mention, too, if you go to thedissidentproject.org, and of course we have a link to it on the website, so you don't even have to remember all that. Just go to the website, pointofview.net. We oppose socialism, fascism, all forms of tyranny. You perhaps have a young person that's convinced that maybe the real solution to all the problems around us is socialism, and maybe it would be good to hear from somebody who has lived under socialism or communism to maybe set them straight. We defend the freedoms that have made America a beacon of hope for the world, including speech, religion, and enterprise. So I wanted you, first of all, to know about what Gabriela Blanco is doing, if you would want to schedule her. Also wanted you to know about the Dissident Project. And if you just have a few minutes, this won't take you long. It only takes about 3 pages to print out. This is a very well-written essay by Gabriela. I grew up in Cuba. America's campus censorship rings alarm bells. And at a time when they're talking about freezing billions of dollars going to Harvard because of some of the things happening there, and also talking about a freeze maybe even to Columbia University and others, I think you would find this to be very helpful. So, Gabriela, thank you for writing the article. Thank you for giving us some time to hear from you. And thank you also for pointing us to the dissidentproject.org in case people would like to contact you. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
We are going to, when we come back from the break, spend some time getting into some of the conflict with ICE, the anti-ICE deportation agitation, as some people have called it. Also, what this new bill would do in terms of deportation. If you have been looking at some of the commentaries, my commentary today is simply asking the question, is rioting acceptable? That comes from Heather McDonald. My one yesterday talked about activist judges, and the one before that talked about assaults on ICE agents. So we're going to be talking about that as a very important issue. But we also have a surprising ruling from the IRS about churches, allowing them to endorse candidates. We have a lot to cover. We'll do that right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Otherwise, just sit back and take some notes, because first of all, I thought it would be good to do sort of quick hits. I've got about a half a dozen here. Maybe I'll just do it in the first segment, because some of these are short but certainly relevant and do not necessarily even justify an entire segment, but they are something to think about. And one of those, of course, we've had some questions people have been asking about what is happening here in the state of Texas. You're well aware, I'm sure, because it's become a national issue, of the flooding in Kerrville, Texas. And of course, as always is the case, and this is so unfortunate, at a time when we're still trying to collect, if I hate to be gross about this, bodies, the politicization that has taken place about whether there were enough people that were meteorologists in this facility. Yes, there were. Matter of fact, twice as many. Whether there were enough warning stations, warning areas. We can go through all of that. Whether this was a result, as some on the other side have said, of some kind of climate modification. Can we just set some of that aside for the fact that this is just a terrible tragedy, and the numbers go up each single day? One of the questions people have asked is, we had heard that one of these young girls by the name of Hunt died. And I've had some people say, well, is that June Hunt's relative? No. June Hunt, first of all, has never been married and doesn't have children. But even so, it'd take a few minutes to explain the family tree of H.L. Hunt. If you've heard it before, you know that there are different Hunts. And this is on the side with Lamar Hunt. And it turns out that Clark Hunt, who is the CEO and owner of the Kansas City Chiefs, well, it is the cousin to him. And I thought it was really poignant that his wife, Tavia Hunt, and of course we've known Clark and Tavia just briefly, not terribly well known, but I've been on a board where they have been very much involved, just posted that they had lost a young cousin who is related to that Hunt side of the family. And I think what she posted was really powerful, so I thought I'd share it with you. Tavia Hunt said, "If your heart is broken, I assure you God is near. He is gentle with your wounds. He is still worthy, even when your soul is struggling to believe it. Trust doesn't mean you're over the pain. It means you're handing it only to the one who can hold it with love and restore what is lost. For we do not grieve as those without hope." And so, powerful statement in the midst of so many lives lost at a Christian camp that many of us have been familiar with, and just a tragedy that is still affecting so many of us. But I thought I would mention that we're still paying attention to that, and maybe there will be a chance to maybe cover that in some depth. But please, let's not politicize something which is a tragedy, a natural tragedy, one that if you're looking for blame, well, blame Mother Nature or the rain or something of that nature, but it just is a really sad commentary indeed. Well, on a positive note, one of the articles I've posted, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about it because Kelly Shackelford. I'm sure we'll talk about it quite a bit on Friday. And that is the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS has actually agreed in federal court that churches and religious organizations can endorse political candidates. That's always been up for question because of what's called the Johnson Amendment that was passed by Senator Lyndon Johnson without much more than a voice vote. And it's always been held over the heads of churches and pastors and Christian organizations. Now, as I've said before, I think most churches would not want to endorse a candidate. Most pastors would not want to endorse a candidate in their official capacity, though some have done so individually. But nevertheless, because of a lawsuit that was brought actually by the national religious broadcasters, they sued the IRS, and this provides clarification. So I'll just read this short statement from Kelly Shackelford, and we'll certainly talk about it more on Friday. But Kelly said, First Amendment rights don't end when a pastor, church member, or even a political candidate steps on the platform of a church. He says the IRS weaponized the Johnson Amendment to silence churches and pastors for decades. This is great news for religious organizations, churches, and religious liberty. Part of that, I think, comes also from the fact that people like Kelly Shackelford and others are serving right now on the National Religious Liberty Commission. And I think it is bringing very important attention to what indeed is happening on the issue of religious liberty. And also, we've had just an enormous number of religious liberty cases come in our direction, 9 of which they have won at First Liberty. I could add whole sorts of others that have been won by Alliance Defending Freedom. And so we really perhaps have more religious freedom now than we've had in half a century. Probably easy to say. But nevertheless, that is the case. A couple other quick hits. Those of you that didn't like taking off your shoes when you go to the airport, the Trump administration is phasing out what is called the most hated airport screening policy that has ever existed. As some people said, always a moronic rule that didn't seem likely to make any of us safer. So those of you that have always been so upset about the fact that you have to take off your shoes in order to go through TSA, looks like that is coming to an end, and that was announced by, of course, the Secretary of Homeland Security. A couple another I thought I would mention as well. We will be, of course, talking about what to do with this immigration issue, because you'll see some of the articles I've posted have to do with illegal immigration and deportation. But there was an alarm sounded just a few days ago by Charlie Kirk. Now, Charlie Kirk does a radio program on Salem Radio Network. We had him at our banquet a while back to give him what was called the Marlon Maddox Award. But he had been hearing from some individuals that were saying, we're trying to pressure the Trump administration to push for amnesty. And so this first was posted on a website. And then actually the statement says, right when ICE, that is, again, Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Border Patrol, finally have the resources they need for mass deportation, we have some of the people inside the D.C. swamp trying to convince President Trump to push for amnesty. Well, if you did not pay attention, I know some of you don't have the time to pay attention, there was a rather significant cabinet meeting the other day in which Donald Trump said there's no amnesty. Then you had the Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rawlings, say no amnesty, mass deportations continue, but in a strategic way, ensuring our farmers have the labor they need. And then Trump said again, we're not talking amnesty. And then the Secretary of Labor also went on to say this does not include amnesty. I think you can conclude that amnesty is not on the table in the Trump administration, as evidenced by the number of people around the table at that cabinet meeting that used the phrase no amnesty. So in case you've heard that rumor, I think we can put that one to bed pretty quickly. Got a couple other issues to talk about, but just a couple of quick hits in the first segment. Some things maybe you've heard and you didn't necessarily know the answer for. Hopefully I've given you some answers, and when we come back, we'll get into some more right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Heather McDonald asked an interesting question. Is rioting acceptable? She follows it up with a question, if so, how much? She focused her attention on two different pictures of what happened in Los Angeles. The first is the official one from California's elected leaders in the media. The second is what she calls the ground-level view from law enforcement. The incident she discussed is what happened when a crowd broke into the ICE detention center downtown to liberate the detainees. The vandals overpowered the skeleton crew of National Guard soldiers using improvised bombs made from M80 firecrackers, nails, and broken glass. Politicians said local law enforcement had everything under control. She even reminds us that the day before, a mob surrounded the two ICE agents. A dozen men jumped out of a truck, grabbed the handcuffed suspect from the back of the ICE van, threw the suspect into the truck, and fled. The ICE agents gave chase, but without sirens or lights, the pursuit was futile. Neither of these two incidents were reported by the media. Instead, the official narrative and the message from the legacy media was that these protests were largely peaceful. They were also labeled by a federal judge as some stray violent incidents. In her commentary, she reminds us of a phrase used by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, defining deviancy down. Our society tends to minimize bad behavior and even criminal behavior. If you've ever read the book of Isaiah, you will recognize this tendency. In Isaiah 5:20, we read, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness." Unfortunately, we seem to be normalizing riots and criminal behavior. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's we can talk about this issue of deportations and ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. And as I've said before, I don't claim to be a prophet or the son of a prophet, but I write my commentaries more than a week before they air and then record them more than a week before they air. So here on Monday, my commentary was about assaults on ICE agents and talking about at the time, the argument was that there had been a 500% increase in assaults on individuals trying to carry out enforcement operations. That number now is up to 700% increase. And again, gave you some quotes from some of the individuals who, because they were using all sorts of claims that these individuals were Nazis or they're like a foreign government taking over our cities and on, that this was not going to go well. And of course, it has not. My commentary today, which again was written more than a week ago, came from some stories I heard from Heather McDonald, who's been on the program, in which she asked the question, is rioting acceptable? And she talks about these attacks in California, of which neither of those had been reported by the press. And I don't think any of us would ever known about this if it weren't for the fact that she had been on the ground interviewing people when this took place. In one where the crowd broke into the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Detention Center, the vandals overpowered the National Guard using all sorts of improvised bombs, M80 firecrackers, nails, broken glass. Talked about another where a mob surrounded two ICE agents, took an individual that had been handcuffed, and they were not able to actually follow him. And all of those stories are, if you will, old news. But here we are broadcasting from the state of Texas, where we have a couple more. And that is, this is our first article by Noah Rothman. He says, the sun had not yet peeked over the horizon over a U.S. Customs and Border Protection facility in McAllen, Texas. This is in the southern part of Texas, very close to the border, when the first shots rang out. At around 6 a.m. on Monday, the CBP officers, these would be Border Protection officers, hit the ground as many dozen rounds were fired at the building, and the agents inside, according to the McAllen police chief, Victor Rodriguez, the officers reclaimed the initiative and returned fire, killing the attacker, who was a 27-year-old individual. We do not mention their name. No federal officers were injured in the attack, but one local police officer is recovering after taking a bullet in the knee. Now, again, the motives have not been determined, but I think, as he said, you can hazard a guess. And again, images from the scene show the driver's side door spray painted with a Latin phrase, "Day in the Heart," in the Call to Duty Black Ops video game that is used as a revolutionary movement to cripple what are called capitalist governments. And so the attack on the law enforcement there has been one of great concern by one individual, but not to be outdone, just a little bit south of where I'm broadcasting, which is in Alvarado, Texas. This is what most people have referred to as a planned ambush. This is, again, something that was an organized and coordinated attack, according to the police officials. Took place around 10:30 p.m. on the 4th of July, and that's where 10 to 12 individuals in black military-style clothing began to shoot fireworks at the facility. Now, about 10 minutes into the attack, one or more of those individuals broke away from the group, began to damage vehicles, spray graffiti, ice, pig, traitor. I won't use all the words. You get the idea. And you might say, why were they shooting fireworks? Well, the plan, it's pretty obvious now, was that they were using the fireworks to draw the ICE agents out of the building so that it would be easier to attack with their rifles. And frankly, as Noah Rothman points out, the plan nearly worked. When one Alvarado police officer approached the facility to investigate the disturbance, the tree line erupted in gunfire, and he was hit in the neck. An additional 20 or 30 rounds were fired at the unarmed correction officers who stepped out of the facility to confront the harassers. And so later, after they were able to collect the material, they recovered jammed rifles, handguns, several magazines of ammunition, 12 sets of body armor, and law enforcement also found flyers, "Fight ICE Terror with Class War, Free All Political Prisoners," as well as a flag that read, "Resist Fascism, Fight Oligarchy." So this has gone from bad to worse. Just a few weeks ago, we were talking about, if this keeps up, people are going to get hurt. Now we're saying people are going to be killed. Quite frankly, if these armed individuals were a better shot, it probably would have been already the case, which again, just I think is a reminder how poor a shot some of these individuals are, but let's leave that for where it is. So again, the border czar, that's Tom Homan, was quick to, again, remind us, where does some of this come from? He says we have senators, we have Congress people who compare ICE to Nazis, compare ICE to racists. So the public thinks, well, If a member of Congress can attack ICE, why can't we? Now, I like Noah Rothman. He says, well, the public is not on the hook for these attacks. It does, however, appear that these attackers shared some assumptions and ideological proclivities that might have led them to be exposed to the Democratic Party's hostile anti-ICE rhetoric. And again, where are the common sense voices in leadership right now in the Democratic Party, even among independents, actually speaking out against this? Noah Rothman says, the mayors of some of these dark blue locales like California and Los Angeles increasingly talk about ICE as though it was an invading army. Brandon Johnson, he's the mayor of Chicago, said, our local police department will never cooperate with ICE, whatever their constitutional authority is. Well, their constitutional authority is they are federal agents. Cooperate with the federal agents. Sort it out later. Don't encourage people to shoot to kill them. The mayor of Los Angeles, that's Karen Bass, said, what I saw in the park looked like a city under siege, under armed occupation. So they keep comparing these individuals to Nazis, to racists, to thugs, to an occupying army like from another country or something like that. And so now you have all sorts of local groups picking up on that. They have rapid mobilization cells, which are designed to spot and to thwart any kind of ICE raids on businesses. Some of them have even used a tool. One of them you probably have heard about, the app called ICE Block, which has been used to actually identify when ICE is coming into a community. And the Justice Department says this is putting federal agents in jeopardy. And, of course, it's, as it says, already getting hot out there because ICE agents are coming under now armed assault. Todd Lyons, who is ICE acting director, said, my officers and agents are already facing a 500% increase in assaults. Now that's been up to 700% increase. And so if you will go to my commentary today, you learn about some of the assaults in California. If you read this one, you learn about some of the assaults that have been taking place in Texas. But we might mention that you go all the way back, interestingly enough, to July of 2019, in which you had an individual loaded himself up with a rifle, ammunition, incendiary devices, and kind of mounted a one-man raid on an immigration detention center back in Tacoma, Washington. Who was eventually shot and killed. So this has been sort of long time coming, but it's gone, as we've said, from bad to worse. And so after the break, let me then try to give you a different perspective, because obviously Noah Rothman is speaking out against this, and I want to give you some things from Ed Kilgore, who's a Democratic strategist. Now, on the one hand, I think he would be the first to say that some of the actions being taken right now cannot be justified, but at the same time also reminds us that these actions are going to increase because, as he puts it, the Trump mega bill will supersize the ICE mass deportation push. You get the sense he's against it. You certainly could believe that he's against Trump. He's against most of the Trump administration. So I wanted you to hear what a person on the other side had to say, but also, in the process, give you a few quotes from J.D. Vance, who had a few things to say about it as well. This is going to be an ongoing battle. We'll keep covering it here on Point of View, and we'll be right back.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's, if we can, before the end of the program today, get into this idea of deportation. Ed Kilgore is a Democratic strategist. I wanted to give you a chance to really hear from people that are probably a lot less sympathetic to Donald Trump. And so he says some of the major elements of Donald Trump's one big, beautiful bill will take time to go into effect. He's talking about Medicaid, SNAP, and all that. But one of those he is convinced will come very quickly. And I agree with him. As a matter of fact, I don't disagree with too much he says in this, although he's got an edge, and that's understandable. And I think I wanted you to hear what an individual as a Democratic strategist would say about this, and that is he is convinced that because this bill has passed, probably the first place you'll see the most significant impact will be in the issue of deportation, which I thought was kind of interesting because he says this provides new funding authorization for immigration enforcement. Off the top of my head, was it $45 billion for the border, $45 billion for immigration enforcement, which would include everything from ICE agents to other particular jurisdictions, because you just have this enormous backlog of individuals who came here seeking asylum. Now, some asylum claims are justifiable. Most are fallacious. That's the trick that was used to get them into the country. And so to sort out those which are valid, which those are not, are very important, which is going to bring me to a piece by Kevin Williamson, which my producer pointed me to. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But let's just again recognize that one of the arguments that was being put forward, and I was not aware of this, by the administration, and in particular by Vice President J.D. Vance, was the concern that some people said the particular bill, the so-called big, beautiful bill, would bankrupt the country. And there is a reason to reject that. If nothing else, I've written a commentary, we've talked about it before, the Congressional Budget Office argument that this is going to lead to $3.3 trillion in additional debt in the national debt is not true, because it only is based upon the assumption that we wouldn't actually extend the 2017 tax cuts. Nevertheless, I can go into that in detail, but he points out that, quote, everything else, the CBO score, the proper baseline, the minutia of the Medicaid policy is immaterial compared to the ICE money and immigration enforcement procedures. He went on to say the one thing that will bankrupt this country more than any other policy is flooding the country with illegal immigration and then giving those migrants generous benefits. And the one big, beautiful bill fixes this problem, and therefore it must pass. So those were the kinds of, if you will, ex-post, used to be called Twitter, posts by J.D. Vance that were trying to convince, and I think were successful in convincing first those in the Senate and especially those in the House. Now, the argument that Ed Kilgore makes is that this new money and this sense of urgency is one that will probably play in the hands of a person that he disagrees with tremendously. He refers to him as an immigration extremist, and that is Stephen Miller. Now, I've always got to be careful about saying anything negative about Stephen Miller since I know another Stephen Miller, but I'm just having some fun with that. But there are some people that have been around him that are convinced that he really wants to push this. But I think to lay all of the blame, as this article does, just on Stephen Miller is to fail to understand that Donald Trump ran on this idea of deportation. He appointed Tom Homan, who we just quoted a minute ago, as the border czar. He has Kristi Noem as the head of Homeland Security. And you probably have heard me on a couple of occasions quote from a couple of other individuals that work there at Homeland Security, and that is Tricia McLaughlin, who oftentimes is on Fox News. So to say that one individual is itching to get people out of this country, I think is a little bit overdone. That being said, some of you might say, well, how do I think about this issue? And let me again, as I oftentimes encourage people to do, get a copy of our Outlook magazine. I'm holding up the article that was in the April issue of Outlook. One of the benefits of giving to Point of View on a regular basis is you'll receive the Outlook magazine. If you actually join the Truth Team, which is $30 a month or more, you also receive the booklets. But this particular article, for those of you watching online right now, has the title Borders, Immigration, Deportations, and the Bible. This goes on for pages, certainly looking at the issue of, does the Bible ever talk about borders and boundaries? Well, yes, it does. What does the Bible say about immigration and the rule of law? A lot of that you find in Romans 13. What does the Bible say about immigration and compassion towards aliens and immigrants? A lot of that's in the Old Testament, in Exodus and Deuteronomy. What are some of the biblical principles we can apply? And it goes on for pages. And again, this is an attempt to try to answer, in some respects, the questions that are now surfacing. Which brings me to my last article, which is from Kevin Williamson. We were hoping to get him on, although I thought the chances were slim and none, and I think Steve found that out to be the case. He's kind of a character. But nevertheless, he has written a piece, and we've posted it for you, which is from the Dispatch, called Clear But False. Now, what does he mean? Well, it turns out that he says that there is this phrase that Jonah Goldberg, who we'd also like to get on, uses from time to time from a political scientist whose name is difficult to pronounce. So I'll just simply say it's a European name with a lot of syllables, consonants, and nevertheless, the argument is what is called the clear but false idea. He begins by using a very simple argument. You probably have seen in some of your local restaurants, winning the fight against hunger starts here. And the implication is that we're trying to have a campaign against food waste. And he says the truth is that waste makes food less expensive than more expensive. The optimal amount of food waste in a restaurant or a grocery store is not zero, which seems counterintuitive until you consider the fact that it costs money to reduce waste. He uses the example, if you go to a McDonald's, a Starbucks, a Whole Foods, they are actually in the business of trying to cut costs. And it turns out that trying to eliminate all food waste would be actually, wait for it, wasteful. And he says this, I think, illustrates the idea. Good policy decisions need to focus on, and we've talked about this before on this program, trade-offs, incentives, even transactional costs and things of that nature. The moralistic argument is always that. What is the optimum? Zero. But it really is rarely. What's the optimum level of illegal immigration? Or what is the optimal level of child abuse or of murder? Well, the moralistic answer is zero. But then think about this. If you wanted to prevent all murders, you'd have to have a camera on every street corner. You'd have to quadruple the size of the military force. You'd have to have almost a coercive authoritarian government. If you wanted to eliminate all child abuse, well, you could have cameras in every home. Would you want that? And so the reality is oftentimes practical policy challenges are ones in which you have to look at trade-offs and the rest. And he uses that by concluding about the story of an Afghan immigrant who at the moment is scheduled to be returned back to his country, and it's quite likely that he would be murdered almost as soon as he arrives. And so while it's, I think, tempting to say we would rather to actually return people back to their country of origin, we recognize that in some cases that doesn't make sense. And it illustrates again why some of this money that has been passed from the so-called Big Beautiful Bill goes to some of these courts. Because if you just have somebody trying to have an emotionalist, exceptionalist, perfect compliance, it doesn't make any sense. And so it is an illustration, again, that what you would want is to have a perfect policy that so sometimes is imperfect because you evaluate some of the costs, the benefits, the trade-offs to trying to achieve that. And that, I think, is only illustrated by the fact that if we have just enormous backlog for anybody claiming amnesty, the chances of getting it right are going to be slim and none, and people are going to be waiting almost a generation to finally get their day in court. So again, I think Kevin Williamson identifies what is called a clear but false idea, and sometimes the moralistic, let's get it to zero, doesn't always make a great deal of sense. But of course, amnesty doesn't either. And of course, I've just talked about that in terms of what Donald Trump said at his last cabinet meeting. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to have Dr. Daniel Schwabauer on, and his book is The God of Story. Again, we always like to have some things that would be helpful to you in terms of understanding the Bible, in terms of living your Christian life, so we'll certainly focus on that. Then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. Matter of fact, I want to take some time to clear up some of the incredible and in some cases really atrocious smears and statements and misstatements and disinformation about the budget bill, and we'll get into that with some detail as well. But I began this section. Oh, by the way, I might just mention that Dr. Schwabauer, who is actually an English teacher in the Mid-America Nazarene University, actually did his doctoral work with Leonard Sweet. Oh, my goodness, that's a name from the past. I don't think we have interviewed him in the last 2 decades, but nevertheless, there was a name as well of some individuals that maybe we'll talk about tomorrow. But I started with some quick hits. Let's end with some quick hits. One of those, I guess, about time to talk about Jeffrey Epstein, right? You ready for that? Of course, if you have seen the cartoon out there right now, it shows the U.S. Attorney General, that's Pam Bondi, February 25th. The Epstein client list is on my desk. Then it shows a picture of Pam Bondi, March 25th. We have lots of names. Then you have, again, a picture of Pam Bondi. We are reviewing everything so we can protect the victims. And then July 25th, of course, it's not quite there yet, is what list? And, of course, it's the 25th, I should say, is 2025. I misspoke there. I was thinking that was the date. That is just the year. So February, the client list is on my desk. March, lots of names. Later on, we're reviewing it. Now, what list? And so a lot of people are saying the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, has a lot to explaining to do. The problem may be worse simply because she's trying to explain it, because back in February, when she failed to deliver on her loudly touted review of the Epstein files, and then told us that, well, there were a lot of people that wanted to see the client list, because the argument might have been, and I think it was, that Jeffrey Epstein might have been blackmailing some of those individuals. Of course, we know some of those that actually did go there. And she says, you're going to see this hopefully tomorrow, and lots of names, lots of information. And we kept hearing about this client list, and now, well, there's really nothing there at all. And the truth could be that maybe there was nothing much there to begin with. If that was the case, then maybe what you're getting from the DOJ, the Department of Justice, and the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, is truthful and accurate. But then that ends up being, if you will, just an unforced error. If there wasn't anything there in the first place, why lead people along to think that there was? And if there is something, then are you ready for all the conspiracies we're going to hear and have already heard that this is all done to try to protect various individuals? So I thought I'd mention that. It's not something we're going to talk much about. I'm sure some of the talk shows will talk about it, but just wanted to at least acknowledge that it is out there. From February now to July, we're getting different stories, and that should cause all of us some concern. While we're talking about some concern, I was shocked to see that the largest teachers union in the country, that would be the NEA, the National Education Association, which has always had a close connection with the ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League, now has said that they are cutting ties with the ADL, in part, I think, because the issue of the Anti-Defamation League began to point out how some of the NEA leaders have been pro-Hamas and obviously anti-Israel. So you will probably hear only a little bit more about that, but I thought I would mention it since one of the big issues we've tried to cover here on Point of View is the astounding rise in anti-Semitism. A number of years ago, I wrote a booklet that we made available to our donors on the whole issue of anti-Semitism, and even quoted from the ADL at that time. But more recently, I've written a new one simply because some of the arguments aren't the classic arguments that are anti-Jewish. They're now coming out of this idea of critical theory, that Israel is the bully, and Hamas and Hezbollah and others are the weak individuals that we need to support. And so, again, I would never have predicted that a fairly liberal group, ADL, and obviously a liberal group, the NEA, would part company, but they have, and just thought I'd mention that one as well. Finally, as we've been talking about the president, this is something we'll probably cover more on Friday with Kelly Shackelford. I think Aaron is going to be with us as well, so we'll have two lawyers sitting across from me. But the Supreme Court actually says now that the president can fire people. I love the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal put it this way. Do you hear the justices now, meaning you judges out there, have you finally heard what the Supreme Court is saying? That's the question they said for lower court judges after the Supreme Court on Tuesday nixed a universal injunction that had barred the Trump administration from even attempting to shrink the federal workforce. The argument, which was actually implemented 8-1, I'll let you guess who the one was. Ketanji Brown Jackson. She's the only one that dissented. But the justices basically said, look, the government is likely to succeed on its argument that the executive order and memorandum are lawful. They also stressed that we express no view on the legality of any agency or reorganization plan. But this is where you had some of the individuals that are actually justices who actually were critical, once again, of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, because she dissented because she said the order includes no mention of congressional buy-in. She said what is issue here is whether the order affects a massive restructuring of the federal government, which led, of course, to a few individuals. In this particular case, the person to break it to her was Sonia Sotomayor, who said, wait a minute, this has nothing to do with the agency reorganization. Plans themselves are not before this court at this stage, and we thus have no occasion to consider whether they can or cannot be carried out consistent with the constraints of law. This is not the first time, nor will it be the last time, that other justices, I mentioned the other day, certainly one of the conservative justices, now on 2 occasions, you've had liberal justices say to the other justice, would you just be quiet? Would you stop writing these things? Of course, she also tends to be the one that talks the most in oral arguments. Would you stop talking? Because you're not making us look very good in that regard. But nevertheless, the point is that this universal injunction that was implemented by one justice was set aside by the Supreme Court. In a sense, they set it aside because we pretty much agree that on the merits, the President of the United States does have a right to hire and to fire people in the executive branch, because if the President does not have that ability, who, pray tell, does? Because he's the head of the executive branch. Well, nevertheless, as I've pointed out before, common sense seems to be breaking out all over the place. And once again, we're seeing that the Supreme Court, in this case, 8-1, ruled, and that one is something which some of the liberal justices are starting to address, even in their concurrences, even in some of the majority opinions, Amy Coney Barrett in particular. And that will be interesting to see how that plays out in the future. We'll talk more about that on Friday with Kelly Shackelford and others from First Liberty Institute. But if you find yourself saying, I'd like to find some of the articles that you've mentioned or the book Killing Sin, it's all available on our website, pointofview.net. Megan, thank you for your help engineering the program. Steve, great to have you before you head off again, producing the program. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net, look at the tabs across the top, find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.